Hello everybody, this is Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and we're back with another of our 5-Minute Histories videos. And today I'm on the corner of Druid Hill Avenue and McMecken Street, and behind me is a plaque to Augusta Chissell. Chissell was a giant in the women's suffrage movement here in Baltimore and Maryland in the 1920s, and the civil rights movement more generally even after that. The plaque is also to a woman named Margaret Hawkins, her neighbor here on Druid Hill Avenue and partner advocate for women's suffrage. Have to say a quick thank you to the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, who in large part was responsible for getting this plaque placed, and also to an organization called the Du Bois Circle, and especially their archivist, Beverly Carter, who dug through years and years of archival material to unearth the stories of Chissell and Hawkins and others that went into making of this plaque. So thank you to you both. Have to say on April 20th, we're doing a tour at the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, so if you want to learn more, please join us then. All right, let's jump in, but before we talk about Augusta Chissell, let's talk a little bit about what was happening in the women's suffrage movement here in Baltimore in the early 1900s. There were groups like the Equal Suffrage League of Baltimore and the Just Government League, also based here, that were crisscrossing the state advocating for the right of women to vote. The women they were advocating for were white women. They excluded black women from their organizations and in fact advocated against giving black women the right to vote, at least in part to try to appease white Southern men and get them on board. Regardless of the motivations, that was the very segregated scene of the suffrage movement here in Baltimore, and the scene into which Augusta Chissell emerged. She was born in 1880 here in Baltimore. By 1907, she and her neighbor, Margaret Hawkins, had formed the Du Bois Circle. The Du Bois Circle was a group of African American women in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. It was an outgrowth of the Niagara Movement that had formed just a few years before. The Niagara Movement, that national movement advocating for civil rights for African Americans. It was formed in part by W.E.B. Du Bois, that lion of intellect that was dominant on the national scene, and that's who the organization was named after. And the Niagara Movement was in response to the end of Reconstruction. After the Civil War, black Americans had the right to vote, but in the late 1880s and 1890s, states started restricting those rights through Jim Crow laws and others, and the Niagara Movement and the W.E.B. Du Bois Circle, the Du Bois Circle, were fighting back against that. Incidentally, Du Bois himself for a while lived in Baltimore in our Morgan Park neighborhood next to Morgan State University. In 1912, Chissell went on to be one of the founding members of Baltimore's NAACP. The NAACP, of course, was founded a few years before that in New York. Chissell served as its first vice president, and under her leadership, and then the later leadership of people like Lily Carroll Jackson, the Baltimore branch grew to be the largest branch of the NAACP in the country. Incidentally, the NAACP was formed with W.E.B. Du Bois as one of its founding members, as well as a number of women journalists, including Mary Ovington, who was white, and a woman named Ida B. Wells, who was black. Some of us may remember the restaurant Ida B. Wells down by City Hall. Chissell was not done. A few years later, 1915, she went on to found or to help become part of a new group called the Progressive Women's Suffrage Club, or the Colored Women's Suffrage Club, that was really led by her friend, a woman named Estelle Young. Chissell was its secretary, and in the living room behind me, in the living rooms of the other members, and in church basements, they printed pamphlets, they hosted speakers, they provided forums where people could hone their arguments on why it was just as important to give black women the right to vote as it was to give white women the right to vote. When the 19th Amendment was finally passed in 1920 in Baltimore and Maryland, it was on the backs of women like Augusta Chissell. She was not done. She realized that getting the right to vote was only part of the battle. Empowering women to actually exercise that right was another key part of the battle. She began, right after the 19th Amendment passed, past, she began a weekly column for the Afro-American newspaper called A Primer for Women Voters. She covered basics like how do you go about registering to vote, as well as covering politics and politicians of the day to educate women when they did get into that voting booth. She also hosted weekly meetings that she called citizens meetings in conjunction with a group called the Colored Young Women's Christian Association, pretty much doing the same thing but in person, empowering women on how to use this new right to vote. Throughout her career, Chissell tried hard to reach across color lines for suffrage and for civil rights generally. She did that through a number of other organizations, including the Women's Auxiliary of the Baltimore Urban League. The Urban League got started a little bit earlier nationally, and then here in Baltimore, our chapter in 1924, and Chissell used that as sort of a community-based organization fighting for civil rights for Black Americans, very much reaching across color lines. And also another group called the Women's Cooperative Civic League, and they worked on public health issues like sanitation and clean drinking water, again raising awareness for social justice issues for white and Black Baltimoreans and women in particular. She worked throughout her 80s and into her 90s with these organizations, particularly with the NAACP here in Baltimore. She died in 1973 and is buried at Mount Auburn Cemetery. So I'm going to wrap up and say the next time you are anywhere near here on this intersection, Druid Hill Avenue and Macon Street, please take a minute, get out of your car, come read the plaque and say thank you to Augusta Chissell and all of her work for women and for civil rights in Baltimore and Maryland.